Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Empathy, Leadership and Behavioural Preference. My name is Michelle MacArthur-Morgan, and I am the Senior Consultant here at Jigsaw Discovery, and along with Keith Nicholson, one of the creators of the Jigsaw Discovery tool, which is a globally licensed behavioural profiling tool. My real passion in life is actually all things behaviour, human behaviour. And for many years now, I've studied behavioural sciences, both from the psychological and the neuroscience perspective. The work that I do, it tends to be with organisations large and small across a diverse range of sectors, but it's all focused around developing agile working practices, psychologically safe workplaces and resilient workforces, really facilitating that development of higher level emotional and cognitive skills, which have been identified as necessary and actually vital now to the success of the future of our organisations. During our time together today, what I'm going to cover are why empathy matters, even more so actually now. What is empathy? Is it actually a skill or a trait? Looking at some of the empathetic behaviours and how do we actually show empathy to somebody else. And that all-important question, if you're a leader, a manager yourself, and you're actually struggling, how can you then show empathy? What can you do to show empathy to somebody else when you yourself are actually struggling? If you have any questions as we go through, I've got my colleague with me here today, Jeanette, who is keeping an eye on the chat and the questions. So please do put questions in the Q&As, and I'll try and take some of those questions perhaps as we go through or at the end, and anything we don't manage to cover, then I'll make sure that I do cover that and send it out in the email that you'll all receive tomorrow with a link to the recording of today. So, why does empathy matter, even more so now? Well, in these divisive times, it may seem that empathy actually could be a lost cause in many cases, because we're living in a world where isolation and tribalism is rampant. And we struggle to understand people who do not think or feel or experience life as we do it. Right now, as we move towards this kind of winter of uncertainty, with further lockdowns on the horizon and no real sight of when it will all end, people are feeling isolated, lonely, worried, and they're hungry for empathy. And they need to be certain of their leaders and certain that they will show up for them in those dark times. The natural human response in times of trauma and tragedy, disaster and fear is to come together, to help one another. And as I say, there's that kind of whole feeling around safety in numbers, being there to support one another. We're tribals, our tribal instinct, should I say. Unfortunately, the COVID-19 response is quite the opposite to that. We cannot come together. In fact, we have to do the opposite. We actually have to physically distance ourselves, both within and outside of the workplace. And by the sounds of what they're predicting, even more of that is to come later on today. The pandemic is creating that inner need, driven by our survival instinct to come together, yet for health reasons, we're not actually able to do that. One of the good things to come out of this pandemic is that we are becoming more aware of the importance and need for empathy. The sad thing is that we should have it should have been important to us all along. It should already be embedded within all our cultures. As we start to move forwards towards establishing new workplace norms, we now have a great opportunity to grow and embrace the change. Organisational cultures could be broken or reborn in this moment. People are struggling, stressed, worried about their jobs, their workloads, their finances, and their futures. They're wanting their leaders to show that they care about them and truly understand their situation. If leaders carry on with the business as usual attitude, ignoring the thoughts, feelings, experiences of team members, then they're giving out a strong signal that they're not there for them, and they won't be there for them in the future should the situation get perhaps even worse. However, if leaders do show up, they have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to have a reborn culture, a culture that is sustainable and supports the organisational values and visions and the health and well-being of employees. So let's just take a look at what empathy is. It's one of those words that we all use, but we often all mean different things by it when we actually use that word. For example, it's often used wrongly when someone is being sympathetic towards another rather than empathetic. Empathy is very different to sympathy. When we are being sympathetic, we are often not being that helpful to the other person. We may be saying that we feel sorry for them, but in actual fact, that could be perceived by the other person in quite a negative context. It could be perceived as you're saying, I'm okay, you're not okay. Or you may be offering unsolicited advice, advice that isn't asked for, isn't wanted, and perhaps may not even be helpful to the other individual. Empathy is not really just one thing at all. It's an umbrella term that describes multiple ways that people respond to one another. Sharing, thinking about, caring about others, thoughts, feelings, and way they are experiencing life. So let's take a little bit of a deeper look at each one of these. So if we start with sharing. Sharing, often referred to as experience sharing or emotional empathy. I feel with you. I feel your distress. I feel your pain. Through the mirror neurons in our brain, we respond to pain or pleasure of others as if it was us experiencing it ourselves. We truly do feel their pain. If you think about it, you've probably watched somebody hit the nail, shall we say, hit the thumb with a hammer when they've been doing a job. And your immediate response is to say, oh, I felt that. And we truly did. Through our mirror neurons, we feel and we can experience other people's pain, both physical and psychological. Sharing or emotional empathy is particularly important for rapport building, for relationships, for team building, for client relationship building. However, if we only have emotional empathy, and our work involves giving bad news on a regular basis, such as in healthcare settings, perhaps, or during periods of large-scale redundancy, one of the dangers can be it can lead to emotional exhaustion and possibly even burnout due to the fact that the leader, the manager, is picking up on the emotions being experienced by the people receiving the bad news. So a word of warning about that emotional empathy. Thinking, often referred to as cognitive empathy or perspective taking. It's about understanding what and how the other person is experiencing, knowing what they will be thinking about and what they will be doing. Cognitive empathy is really important for performance feedback and communication in general. If a person only has cognitive empathy, then they can use it to manipulate and take advantage of others because they don't really feel the other person's pain or pleasure. Caring or empathetic concern. It's a felt sense, a motivation. When we see someone in trouble, we instinctively want to help them. When we have empathetic concern, we take time out to help others develop their strengths, to give feedback. We're concerned with helping other people. We want other people to be the best they can, to have the best life. We want their situation to be better. Empathetic concern is actually what differentiates an outstanding leader. However, in these dark and challenging times that lay ahead, leaders need to be able to operate at full strength in all three areas of empathy: thinking, caring, and sharing. So I'd just like to move on and just start to look at empathy and leaders. And start really with one of the challenges of being a leader is that all too often our leaders are people who have been promoted because they're really good at doing a job. And they get promoted, but then they're not given that leadership development. So they're really good at doing the job, or a job, hence they got the promotion. But unless they actually receive that growth and development of their leadership skills, then they tend to end up just micromanaging. Leadership is not about being in charge. It's about being responsible for the people who do the job. A leader's job is about being concerned about human beings, the employees, and not just the results. People must come first. If we take the current situation, if all your leaders are focusing on is the results, the outcomes, the bottom line, what message is this giving out to employees? If you're making people redundant, hugely impacting on people's livelihoods, just to balance the books, how bad could that actually be for business? It could destroy any trust and any goodwill that you had with employees and possibly even your customers. And for the people who keep their jobs, what could be the impact for them? They may start coming to work afraid because they're afraid that they may be next. So they're less likely to speak out. They'll keep their heads down. They won't take risks. They won't come up with those innovative ideas. They won't ask for help. They'll be afraid to make a mistake. And overnight, a culture of lie and hide could be born. And if we think about the impact that that will have on the future of our businesses, less empathetic managers will probably believe they had no choice and blame it on COVID or the government. However, more empathetic leaders will find a way to safeguard jobs, perhaps pivoting the business, finding new ways of operating. I was reading earlier this week about a pizza restaurant that realised that they had assets that they could use. They couldn't open as a restaurant at that time, but they decided they could actually use the assets they had, in fact the pizza oven, to make PPE. There are businesses, numerous businesses, who have taken their products and services online or found new ways of operating to be COVID safe. So what can our leaders do? The first thing I'd like to do is answer that question about empathy. Is it a skill that can be developed or a trait that is fixed? The great news is that empathy is a skill which can be grown and developed. And the best way to think about this is think about it a little bit like a muscle. The more you use that muscle, the more you practice, the stronger that muscle becomes. The more you use empathy, the more you practice empathy, the more empathetic you will become. So how can we actually help ourselves to develop that empathy? I want to give you 3 little tips here of different things that you can actually do to start to develop your empathetic muscle. The first thing, make curiosity a habit. Imagine you're in a supermarket and you see a mum with a young child, and the young child is having a full-blown tantrum. And the mum appears to be doing very little. She's just kind of stood there, not really saying anything, not really doing anything, doesn't really seem to be in control at all. Is your natural instinct to think to yourself, well, she's a terrible mother? Just look at her standing there while the kid just kicks off in front of all these people. How embarrassing. You know, some people shouldn't really be allowed to have children. Or what if you asked yourself, I wonder what's going on for the mum? Maybe she's just overwhelmed by it all. Maybe she's not getting enough sleep. Maybe she's not feeling too great. Maybe she's got a really throbbing headache. Or really just doesn't know what to do. Maybe she could do with a friendly face and some support and reassurance. By being curious, you switch from being judgmental to asking questions and perspective taking, putting yourself, trying to imagine what it is like for the other person. And that then may lead to increased empathetic concern and increased motivation to reach out to that mum. The second little tip is widen your circle. Make it your business to go out of your way to talk to new people, to different people. We tend to all have our in-groups and out-groups, our inner circle that we tend to kind of mix with and socialise with and talk to at work. And people that are outside of that group, we tend not to. And science shows us that in actual fact, the people that are outside that kind of in-group, we are less likely to be empathetic towards. And we know that by reaching out to people outside our group and actually having those conversations with them, getting to know them, actually increases our neurological likelihood of being more empathetic towards them. Think about within organisational life. If you're a senior manager, your in-group will be other senior managers. So spend some time, go out of your way to spend some time getting to know more junior members of the team. That will then help you to be more empathetic, more understanding of the way that they're thinking, the way they're feeling, and the way they are experiencing the current situation. My third tip might seem a little bit strange to some people, but you can actually practice your empathy on fictional characters. It turns out that you can practice empathy skills by reading literary fiction. And that's because they usually have complex characters which drive the story. And as the reader, you're drawn in emotionally to their desires and motivations, and you're having to perspective take, you're having to put yourself in their shoes. Now on the slide, I've put down some examples there of the types of literary, the types of books that I'm suggesting that can actually help. Something that is complex, has complex characters that can draw you in, where you really have to think about and understand the person's perspective. I found this last week actually. I was watching on TV the programme on ITV called Des. And I found all the way asking myself, why is he being like that? Why is he being so open about what he's done? Why is he being so cool and calm? What's his motivation? What's driving him? And I was desperately trying to kind of empathize and understand what was his motivation? What was driving him to go on and commit those murders? And then, but actually what was driving him to actually confess the way he did and be so open about it? So let's look now at some of those kind of leadership behaviours that we're likely to see when our leaders are being empathetic. So some of the behaviours include listening deeply, not just to the words, but verbal and non-verbal communication, being there in the moment, being present in that conversation with the individual. Asking questions, that curiosity thing again, and more than just a passing interest in people. Asking questions and listening to the answers. Acknowledging how the person or people, how they're actually feeling, connecting with their pain, their worries. It helps the individual feel more supported, and it could also perhaps validate that what they're going through is difficult. It is difficult at the moment. Express your vulnerability. Open up and share your vulnerability and your feelings. Again, it's about making that connection. Showing appreciation or some gratitude for them actually opening up, for their honesty. When someone opens up to you, it shows that they really trust you, and that trust should be acknowledged. Supportive actions and gestures. Now, we've seen quite a lot of examples of these recently, and you've seen people posting on LinkedIn. And it's those kind of return to work packs that some organisations have actually sent out to their team, or those lockdown gifts. I saw quite a few people receiving Betty gift packs, Betty's tea rooms gift packs and things like that. Asking people how you can actually help, offering help. Not telling the person what they need, but asking what they think they need. What can you do to help? And then taking that action and following through. One of the challenges facing leaders is that despite their efforts to elevate empathy within the organisations, to get empathy up there on the agenda, to actually inform their managers to talk about empathy, to show that vulnerability. Despite that, sometimes team members just don't feel it on the ground. That feeling isn't actually coming through. And there's this kind of disconnect occurs. The reasoning behind that can be that sometimes empathy can feel a little bit fuzzy or touchy-feely concept. This is usually down to the lack of understanding of what it actually means to be an empathetic organisation. Being an empathetic organisation doesn't mean that you have to go around hugging everybody. It doesn't mean that you have to give in to everyone's wants and whims. And it doesn't mean that you can't give honest feedback. When leaders show empathy, it's about making people feel safe, making people feel listened to, cared for. And if we do that, then we find that actually we reap the benefits from that, because they tend to take more risks, they feel more creative, more engaged, they're more inclusive and more productive. If you've attended some of our webinars previously, you've probably heard me speak on many occasions about the SCARF model developed by Dr. David Rock. The SCARF model is one of the most useful tools to help leaders be more empathetic. It helps team members to feel heard, to feel valued and understood. Everything we've been talking about so far. The SCARF model can help a leader actually bring some balance to a situation, because often the threats that are occurring we cannot control, or we have very little control over, certainly at the moment. So the role of the leader is to try and balance out some of those threats by giving SCARF rewards. An example of that, for example, is performance conversations. Leaders can use the SCARF model to be more empathetic. They can use it to perspective take, to predict how the team member will be feeling, what they will be thinking. And then within the performance conversation. They can use SCARF again because they can invite the team member to speak first, producing a status reward. They can ask a team member how can they support them, producing an autonomy reward. So SCARF model is a very, very useful model in many, many different areas of leadership. But this is just one example where you can use it within empathy and to help you be more empathetic in your leadership style. So why do leaders lack empathy? Well, I already mentioned about it can be perceived as being a bit fuzzy. But in addition to that, there are some other reasons that leaders lack empathy. For example, organisational structures or systems which actually prevent or don't reward empathetic behaviour. Some people, they just turn up for work. They don't have any passion or belief in the work that they do. They're not engaged with the work. And empathy actually requires quite an investment of time and energy. And they might just not have that motivation to do that. Another interesting reason why not, coming from neuroscience, the neural pathways that we used to think about other people are the same neural pathways that we used to think about ourselves. And if you think about the role of a leader, they spend a very high percentage of their time focusing on strategy, on results, share prices, and very little time thinking about themselves. Therefore, the neural pathway has high electrical resistance. It's not developed. And therefore, it's very draining on the leader's energy when they do actually try and use that pathway. So they're less likely to use it naturally because the brain is programmed for survival. It's all about conserving energy. So it's much harder for some people to actually think about people. It's much more draining on their energy. And another reason is there's also a link between being in a position of power and empathy. Research done by Michael Krauss from Yale found that people who were less privileged, were poor or lonely, tended to be more empathetic naturally, because the survival instinct in them recognized that in order to survive, they need other people. But as people rise and get promoted, then we tend to kind of think that we don't need other people as much. We've got everything. I don't need other people now. I'm up there. And so our motivation to be empathetic is reduced. Now, this is not to say that they cannot be empathetic. It's about having awareness. It's about finding a way past those motivational barriers that can get in the way of that empathetic concern. The fifth reason why a leader may lack empathy can be explained by way of behavioural preferences. Some behavioural preferences naturally lend themselves to higher levels of empathy. For example, people who have a thinking preference, who focus on facts, figures, strategies, and results, will have to work hard to show empathy in comparison to an individual's higher feeling preference. When we start to explore thinking and feeling preferences and empathy, we can start to see some of the reasons why leaders who have higher levels of self-awareness tend to have higher levels of empathy. An individual with a thinking preference may find it quite hard to express their feelings and their vulnerabilities, whereas a feeling person may not express their vulnerability because they don't want to burden the other person. They just want to help them. A person with a feeling preference will tend to have a higher level of motivation, empathetic concern. Whereas a person with a thinking preference may increase the range of empathetic concern by reframing empathy for others as a way to help the individual grow and perform, which will in turn get the result or outcome. Now, what they're doing there, they're actually driving a feeling action of showing that empathy, that concern, that understanding. But they're driving a feeling action from a thinking motivation, or with thinking motivation. We've already said that empathy is not fixed. We all have an empathy range, and with practice we can actually develop and increase that range. By being self-aware and understanding our behavioural preferences, it helps us to identify development areas that we might want to focus on to increase that empathy range. So a person with a thinking preference may consider working on their curiosity and widening their circle of contacts as a way of developing that range. A person who is perhaps quite a high introvert may actually choose to develop their empathy levels by reading. Again, developing and practicing that empathetic concern, and developing the empathy muscle, as I called it earlier. Now, a person with a feeling preference, who I mentioned earlier, may be more prone to perhaps emotional exhaustion and burnout. If they're not aware of that tendency, then they become over emotionally involved. So a person with a high feeling preference, through that understanding and that awareness of that preference, they may realise that actually one of the things they need to do is to practice letting go and perhaps being a little bit more objective. Leaders must know who they are. They must know their strengths, their preferences, their passions and areas of development. And these are the foundations actually of success and empathy. Behavioural profiling tools such as the Jigsaw Discovery tool, they provide insight into your preferences, the range of empathy. They help you extend and develop that range of empathy to foster opportunities to adapt your thinking and behaviour. They help you to be more productive, to appreciate those motivators, those strengths, and identify those developmental areas. Jigsaw Discovery can provide insights into how others see you and how you understand their feelings and preferences. It can help you to perspective take. Leaders who have higher levels of self-awareness and understanding of others tend to have increased range of empathy and are seen by other people as being empathetic leaders. I've spoken a lot about the need for the leader to be empathetic, but what if they want to be empathetic, but they are just struggling themselves? They can barely look after themselves, let alone anyone else. The first thing leaders should do is self-care. Empathy starts at home. They need to show themselves some compassion. Just as they'd like to show that compassion to other people, they need to show compassion to themselves. And that can be very hard to do. It's often easier to show compassion to other people. But leaders need to start and show that compassion to themselves. Another way of still showing some empathy and building empathy, even when you're struggling yourself, is to actually use your vulnerability as a way of opening the door and making an empathetic connection with other people. by opening the door, by showing that vulnerability, by making that connection, it can be a mutually beneficial and supporting connection, rather than the leader feeling that they're draining what little energy they have left. It can actually turn into quite a replenishing relationship as they kind of reach out and help other people. And it's a mutual benefit. Support is going two ways. So before we close the webinar, if there are any questions, please put them in the questions tab. If anybody's got any questions.
Nothing so far.
Okay. If at the moment there's nothing in there, but please do feel free to put anything in there, ask any questions at all. I'm quite happy if you put them in. I'll leave that open for a moment or two, and I can also answer them by email later. If anybody has got a question that they'd rather just email to me, that's absolutely fine. You can send me an email, you'll get details at the end of the session. And if anybody wants to find out more about the Jigsaw Discovery Tool, then watch for we've got some showcases coming up in October. Or if you'd like to discuss developing empathy, the empathy skills of your leaders, then by all means, contact me. Let's arrange a Zoom call and we can have a quick Zoom call and talk through your situation. I'm quite happy to give you some hints, some tips, things that you can do by way of supporting your leaders to actually develop those empathy skills, those empathy muscles. So on that note, no questions in there at the moment. I would like to say thank you very much to everybody for attending today. And I hope you have an absolutely great afternoon, a fantastic afternoon, and hope to speak to some of you soon. Thank you.